Before there was a flag, before there was a constitution, before there was a president, before there was even a name, there was a land so vast, so wild, so impossibly rich that every empire on earth wanted a piece of it. And the story of how that land became the most powerful nation in human history is not a clean story. It is not a simple story. It is a story soaked in blood and brilliance, in betrayal and bravery, in catastrophic failure and miraculous reinvention. It is a story that is still being written today, and it is a story that nobody has ever told in full, from the very first human footstep on American soil all the way to the present day, until right now. Welcome to History and Mystery. I am so glad you are here, and if you have never been to this channel before, let me tell you something, you picked the right day to show up. What you are about to hear is the complete, uncut, no shortcuts history of the United States of America. Every empire, every war, every revolution, every scandal, every miracle, and every mystery that made this nation what it is. We are going to cover more than 15,000 years of history, and I promise you, you will not be bored for a single second. Before we dive in, I want to ask you one thing. If this kind of deep, immersive, full-length history content is what you're looking for, please hit that subscribe button right now. It costs you nothing, it means everything to this channel, and it guarantees that you never miss a single story. Drop a comment down below telling me which era of American history you find most fascinating. Is it the ancient civilizations, the colonial era, the Revolution, the Civil War, the World Wars? Tell me, because your comments genuinely help shape what we cover next. And if you find this video worth your time, share it with someone who loves history. Now let us go back, way back, further back than most history books ever bother to go. The story of America does not begin in 1776. It does not begin in 1492. It does not begin when Christopher Columbus stepped off a ship and made the most consequential wrong turn in the history of navigation. The true story of America begins somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, when the first human beings crossed into the North American continent and began one of the greatest chapters in the story of our species. Picture this: the world is locked in the grip of the last ice age. Glaciers cover much of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels are dramatically lower than they are today, so much lower that a vast stretch of land, nearly 1,000 miles wide, connects what is now Siberia to what is now Alaska. Scholars call this land Bridge Beringia, and it was not some narrow, frozen crossing. It was a massive, habitable landscape, with grasslands and animals, and everything a group of hunter-gatherers needed to survive. For thousands of years, people crossed that bridge in waves. They were not thinking about discovering a new continent. They were following the animals. They were doing what humans have always done, moving toward food, toward warmth, toward survival. But in doing so, they became the first Americans, and what they built over the next 15,000 years would be nothing short of extraordinary. These first peoples spread south and east with breathtaking speed, at least in geological terms. Within a few thousand years, human beings had reached the tip of South America. They had populated every corner of two vast continents. They had adapted to every climate imaginable: the frozen tundra of the Arctic, the lush forests of the Pacific Northwest, the scorching deserts of the Southwest, the towering mountains of the Rockies, the fertile river valleys of the Midwest, the subtropical swamps of the Southeast. And they did not just survive in these environments. They thrived, they innovated, they built cultures of remarkable complexity and beauty. In the American Southwest, a civilization called the ancestral Pueblones, you may know them by the older, contested name Anasazi, were constructing multi-story cliff dwellings carved directly into the faces of canyon walls. These were not simple shelters. They were sophisticated communities with hundreds of rooms, communal gathering spaces, complex irrigation systems, and astronomical alignments built into their architecture. Chaco Canyon in present-day New Mexico was the center of a vast trade network stretching across hundreds of miles. The people of Chaco built roads, actual engineered roads, perfectly straight, cutting through the desert, connecting dozens of communities across the region. They were building this civilization more than 1,000 years before Europeans arrived. In the Mississippi River Valley, another civilization was rising that most Americans today have never heard of, and that is a genuine shame, because it was one of the largest urban centers on Earth at the time of its peak. The city of Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, Illinois, had a population that may have reached 20,000 people at its height around the year 1100 AD. That made it larger than London at the same time. Cahokia's skyline was dominated by massive earthen mounds, the largest of which, Monk's Mound, still exists today and covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The people of Cahokia practiced complex religious ceremonies, maintained long-distance trade networks stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, and organized their society in ways that suggest a sophisticated political structure. Then mysteriously, around 1300 AD, Cahokia was abandoned. No one knows exactly why. Climate change, social upheaval, resource depletion, or some combination of all three, the mystery remains unsolved to this day. In the Pacific Northwest, nations like the Chinook, the Haida, and the Tlingit were building some of the most elaborate artistic traditions in the Western Hemisphere. Their totem poles, their longhouses, their cedar canoes, their ceremonial masks, these were not just objects. They were encyclopedias of cultural knowledge, genealogy, and spiritual meaning encoded in wood and paint and song. On the Great Plains, mobile communities followed the vast bison herds that once numbered in the tens of millions, moving across an ocean of grass that stretched from Canada to Texas. These were not primitive nomads. They were sophisticated hunters who understood animal behavior, seasonal migration, and landscape management at a level that modern wildlife biologists are still working to fully appreciate. In the eastern woodlands, powerful confederacies were forming. The most remarkable of these was the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, which united 5, and later 6, nations under a constitution of governance that some historians and political scientists have argued was one of the direct intellectual influences on the framers of the United States Constitution. The Great Law of Peace established principles of representative governance, separation of powers, and checks and balances that were operating in North America centuries before the Philadelphia Convention. And in the Southeast, nations like the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw had developed agricultural societies, permanent towns, ceremonial centers, and systems of law and governance of remarkable sophistication. The mound-building tradition of the Mississippian culture had given birth to a series of powerful chiefdoms that would still be going strong when the first Europeans arrived. In total, when European contact began in the late 1400s, scholars now estimate that somewhere between 50 million and 100 million people were living in the Americas. North America alone likely held between 7 and 18 million people, speaking hundreds of distinct languages, practicing dozens of different religions, and organized into political structures that ranged from small bands to large confederacies. This is the America that existed before America. This is the world that European contact would shatter. And understanding this world, understanding its richness, its complexity, its humanity, is essential to understanding everything that came after. On the morning of October 12, 1492, a Genoese sailor in the employ of the Spanish crown stepped ashore on an island in what we now call the Bahamas. His name was Christopher Columbus, and he believed with absolute certainty that he had reached the eastern edge of Asia. He was wrong, as history records with gentle irony, but the consequences of his mistake would reshape the entire world. Columbus had not set out to discover America. He had set out to find a western sea route to Asia, bypassing the land routes that were controlled by Ottoman and Arab middlemen. The Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella had funded his voyage not out of scientific curiosity, but out of pure commercial interest. They wanted spices, they wanted silk, they wanted the wealth of Asia flowing directly into their treasury. What they got instead was something they could not have imagined in their wildest dreams. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas between 1492 and 1504. He never set foot on the North American mainland. He explored the Caribbean, the coast of Central America, and the northern coast of South America. And with him came the beginning of a process that would be, depending on your perspective, the greatest adventure in human history or the greatest catastrophe, quite possibly both at the same time. The Spanish moved fast. Within decades of Columbus's first landing, they had conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico and the Inca Empire in South America. The conquistadors, men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, moved with a combination of military brilliance, extraordinary ruthlessness, and extraordinary luck through 2 of the most powerful civilizations in the world and dismantled them in shockingly short order. But the most powerful weapon the Spanish carried was not steel or gunpowder. It was something they did not even know they were carrying. It was disease. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to the illnesses that Europeans had lived with for generations: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, cholera. These diseases spread through native populations with a speed and lethality that is almost impossible to comprehend. Modern estimates suggest that within a century of European contact, somewhere between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas had died from disease. Some regions lost 95% or more of their people. The sheer scale of this demographic catastrophe, and catastrophe is not too strong a word, had consequences that echo all the way to the present day. It depopulated entire regions, creating the impression among later European settlers that the land was empty and unclaimed. It was not. It had been full of people. Those people were simply gone. While Spain was building its empire in the south, other European powers were eyeing the north with growing interest. John Cabot, an Italian sailing for the English crown, reached the coast of North America in 1497, just 5 years after Columbus. Giovanni de Verrazzano explored the east coast for France in 1524, and Jacques Cartier pushed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence in 1534, claiming Canada for the French king. The great European powers were circling North America, each trying to find its own piece of the prize. The Spanish were first to make a serious attempt at permanent settlement in what is now the United States. In 1565, they established St. Augustine in present-day Florida, the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States, a fact that surprises many people who think American history begins in New England. The Spanish also pushed north from Mexico into the southwest, establishing missions in New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Texas. The Spanish colonial presence in America was vast, long-lasting, and deeply influential, yet it is often overlooked in histories that focus primarily on the English colonists who would eventually come to dominate the eastern seaboard. The French, meanwhile, were building their own empire based not primarily on conquest and settlement, but on the fur trade. French traders and missionaries pushed deep into the interior of North America, establishing relationships with native nations that were different in character, though not necessarily more benevolent, from the Spanish and English approaches. The French founded Quebec in 1608, and from there their influence spread across the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi River all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, staking a claim to an enormous swath of the continent. The English were late arrivals to the colonization game, but they would prove to be the most consequential. The first serious English attempt at a permanent settlement in North America ended in one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. In 1587, a group of 117 English settlers, including men, women, and children, landed on Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. Their leader, John White, sailed back to England for supplies. When he returned 3 years later, in 1590, the settlement was completely abandoned. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into a wooden post. The settlers were never found. The fate of the lost colony of Roanoke has never been definitively explained, and it remains one of the enduring mysteries of early American history. But the English kept coming, and in 1607, they finally established a foothold that would stick. In the spring of 1607, 3 small English ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, sailed into a broad river on the coast of Virginia. The 104 men aboard established a settlement they called Jamestown, named for their king, James I. It was the first permanent English settlement in North America, and its early years were an almost unbroken record of disaster, suffering, and near-total failure. The men who came to Jamestown were, by and large, not prepared for what they found. Many of them were gentlemen, men who expected to find gold lying on the ground, who had no experience with farming or physical labor, who had come to get rich quick rather than to build a lasting community. They chose their settlement site badly. It was swampy, mosquito-infested, the water was brackish, and it was surrounded by the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, whose leader, Seneca, was watching the newcomers with a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and growing alarm. The winters of 1609 and 1610 became known as the Starving Time. Of the approximately 500 colonists who were in Jamestown when the fall of 1609 began, only about 60 were still alive by the following spring. Desperate and starving, some colonists reportedly resorted to eating leather, rats, and even, according to some accounts, the bodies of the dead. When a relief ship arrived in May 1610, the survivors were literally boarding boats to abandon the colony when it appeared in the river. The colony was nearly over before it really began. What saved Jamestown was not gold. There was no gold, but tobacco. John Rolfe, who would later famously marry Pocahontas, developed a strain of tobacco from Caribbean seeds that suited the Virginia soil and proved enormously popular in England. Suddenly, Jamestown had a cash crop. Suddenly, the colony had an economic reason to exist. And with that economic reason came waves of new settlers, and with those settlers came land hunger, and with that land hunger came the systematic dispossession and destruction of the Powhatan Confederacy and every other native nation in their path. The tobacco economy created another monumental, catastrophic development, the introduction of enslaved African labor to the English colonies. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, brought by an English privateer who had taken them from a Portuguese slave ship. For the first few decades, the legal status of Africans in Virginia was ambiguous. Some served as indentured servants and gained their freedom. But as the tobacco economy boomed and the demand for cheap labor became insatiable, Virginia and the other southern colonies began formalizing the institution of race-based chattel slavery. By the 1660s, the legal framework of American slavery, the idea that enslaved status was hereditary and attached specifically to people of African descent, was being written into colonial law. A catastrophe was being institutionalized, one that would define, divide, and nearly destroy the nation for the next 2 centuries, and whose consequences are still felt today. While Virginia was stumbling towards survival in the South, a very different kind of colonial project was beginning in New England. In 1620, a group of religious separatists, the Pilgrims, crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower and landed at Plymouth in what is now Massachusetts. Unlike the Jamestown settlers, the Pilgrims had not come for wealth, they had come for religious freedom. They had been persecuted in England for their refusal to conform to the Church of England, and they were willing to risk everything, their lives, their comfort, their families, for the right to worship as they believed. The Mayflower Compact, signed before the Pilgrims even left their ship, was a remarkable document. It was a voluntary agreement among the colonists to create a government based on the consent of the governed, a concept that would prove foundational to American political thought. The first winter was brutal, and about half of the Mayflower passengers died. But with crucial assistance from the Wampanoag people, particularly a man named Squanto, who had previously been kidnapped and taken to England and spoke English, the colony survived and eventually found its footing. 10 years later, in 1630, a much larger wave of Puritan settlers arrived in Massachusetts Bay under the leadership of John Winthrop, who famously described the new colony as a city upon a hill, a beacon of godly civilization that would serve as a model for the world. The Massachusetts Bay Colony grew rapidly and spawned daughter colonies throughout New England. The Puritans were intelligent, educated, intensely religious people who built schools and churches and town governments with remarkable speed and effectiveness. But they were also deeply intolerant of anyone who disagreed with them. Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts for his radical ideas about religious tolerance and the separation of church and state, and went on to found Rhode Island, which became a haven for religious dissenters. Anne Hutchinson, who dared to hold theological discussions in her home and challenge the authority of the Puritan clergy, was also banished and eventually killed in an attack by native people in what is now New York. The New England colonies, the Mid-Atlantic colonies, and the Southern colonies were developing along very different lines, different economies, different social structures, different religious cultures, different relationships with native peoples. But they shared one thing: they were all growing, all spreading westward, all pushing against the territories of native nations that had lived on this land for millennia. The consequences were predictable and tragic. In 1637, the Pequot War in New England ended with the massacre of Mystic, in which English forces surrounded a Pequot village and set it on fire, cutting down anyone who tried to escape. Hundreds of people, mostly women, children, and elderly, were killed in a matter of minutes. In 1675, a massive conflict known as King Philip's War, the English name for a Wampanoag leader named Metacom, engulfed New England. It was, proportionally, one of the deadliest wars in American history. Dozens of colonial towns were attacked and burned. Thousands of colonists died. But native casualties were even higher, and when the war ended, the Wampanoag Confederation and many other New England tribes had been effectively destroyed. The native world of New England never recovered. And yet, even as colonial society was built on the dispossession and destruction of native peoples and the exploitation of enslaved African labor, it was also developing political and intellectual traditions that would eventually give birth to revolution. The colonial assemblies, the town meetings, the tradition of elected representation, the Puritan emphasis on literacy and education, the growing culture of debate and dissent, these were all accumulating into something powerful, something that was gradually becoming distinct from England, something that was becoming, without quite knowing it yet, American. By 1700, there were roughly 250,000 European settlers in the 13 colonies. By 1750, that number had grown to more than 1 million. The colonies were prospering. They were trading. They were arguing with their colonial governors and with the Parliament in London, and they were beginning, in small ways, to think of themselves not just as English subjects who happened to live in America, but as Americans. But before the colonies could become a nation, they had one more episode of imperial warfare to get through, and that episode would change everything. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, was in many ways the first truly global conflict in history, fought on 5 continents simultaneously. In North America, it was a struggle between the British and French empires for control of the continent, with native nations allied on both sides playing a crucial and often overlooked role. The war began in the American frontier in 1754, when a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington led a disastrous attack on a French patrol and then was forced to surrender Fort Necessity to French forces. It was, Washington would later admit, the most dishonorable moment of his career. But the war went well for Britain in the end. By 1763, France had ceded virtually all of its North American territory east of the Mississippi to Britain, and Spain, which had entered the war on France's side, ceded Florida. Britain was now the dominant power in North America, and that dominance set off a chain of events that nobody in London or the colonies could have predicted. The war had been enormously expensive, and the British government decided, with a logic that seemed perfectly reasonable in London and perfectly outrageous in the colonies, that the American colonists should help pay for it. After all, the war had been fought partly to protect the colonies from French aggression. Why should British taxpayers bear the entire burden? And so Parliament began passing a series of acts designed to raise revenue from the colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765 imposed taxes on paper documents of all kinds: newspapers, legal papers, pamphlets, playing cards. The Townshend Acts taxed glass, paint, paper, and tea. The colonists were furious, not primarily because of the money. The taxes were actually relatively modest, but because of the principle. The colonists had their own elected assemblies. They had a long tradition of taxing themselves through their own representative governments, and Parliament, in which they had no representation at all, was now imposing taxes on them without their consent. The rallying cry that emerged was as simple as it was electrifying: no taxation without representation. The colonial resistance was creative, passionate, and increasingly organized. Sons of Liberty groups formed in cities throughout the colonies. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions asserting their rights. And brilliant writers and thinkers, James Otis, Samuel Adams, John Dickinson, began articulating a political philosophy that drew on John Locke, on English common law, on classical republicanism, and on the colonists' own lived experience to argue that what Britain was doing was not just inconvenient but fundamentally illegitimate, a violation of the natural rights of free people. Tensions escalated. In 1770, British soldiers stationed in Boston, resented by the population and taunted in the streets, opened fire on a crowd and killed 5 men. Patriot propagandists, most brilliantly Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, turned the incident into a massacre, the Boston Massacre, and used it to inflame colonial opinion. In 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped an entire cargo of East India Company tea into the water, in protest of a tea tax they had not voted for. The Boston Tea Party was a spectacular act of political theater, and the British responded with the coercive acts, the intolerable acts, as the colonists immediately called them, which closed Boston Harbor, revoked Massachusetts's charter, and required colonists to house and feed British soldiers. This was too far. Even colonists who had hoped for reconciliation began to give up on that hope. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They were not yet calling for independence. Most of them still considered themselves loyal British subjects who were fighting for their constitutional rights, but they agreed to coordinate their resistance and to meet again if things did not improve. Things did not improve. On April 19, 1775, British regulars marched out of Boston to seize colonial military supplies stored in Concord, Massachusetts. At Lexington, they encountered a small group of Minutemen, colonial militia, and someone fired a shot. Nobody knows to this day who fired first, but it became known as the shot heard round the world, and it started a war. The battles of Lexington and Concord, followed quickly by the colonial seizure of Fort Ticonderoga and the bloody Battle of Bunker Hill, technically Breed's Hill, transformed a political dispute into an armed conflict. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia and faced the urgent task of organizing and supplying a colonial army fighting the most powerful military force in the world. They appointed George Washington, tall, imposing, distinguished, and almost supernaturally calm under pressure, as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And yet, even as the shooting had started, many colonial leaders still hesitated to say the word that was on everyone's mind: independence. It took a small, electric pamphlet to push them over the edge. In January 1776, a recent immigrant from England named Thomas Paine published Common Sense. It was only about 50 pages long, but it was one of the most consequential pieces of writing in American history. Paine wrote not in the elegant, circumspect language of educated gentlemen, but in plain, fierce, direct prose that anyone could understand. He demolished the idea that monarchy was a legitimate form of government. He argued that the colonists' grievances could never be resolved within the framework of the British Empire. He made the case for independence with a clarity and passion that was genuinely revolutionary, and in the first months after its publication, Common Sense sold roughly 500,000 copies in a country of about 2.5 million people. It was a cultural earthquake. By June 1776, the Continental Congress was ready. A committee was appointed to draft a formal declaration. Its primary author was a 33-year-old Virginia planter and lawyer named Thomas Jefferson, who worked in his rented rooms in Philadelphia for 17 days, quill in hand, trying to find the words that would justify a revolution to the world. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. Its opening sentences remain among the most quoted words in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words were extraordinary, and they were also, as Jefferson and every man who signed that document knew perfectly well, words that the nation they were founding was not yet living up to. Jefferson himself enslaved more than 600 human beings over his lifetime. The contradiction between the soaring ideals of the Declaration and the lived reality of slavery was baked into the founding of the United States, and it would demand a reckoning. But for now, there was a revolution to win. Fighting a revolution against the British Empire was a bit like an amateur boxer climbing into the ring with the heavyweight champion of the world. Britain had the most powerful navy on earth, a professional army hardened by decades of warfare, the financial resources of a global empire, and the experience of fighting wars on multiple continents simultaneously. The Continental Army, by contrast, was perpetually short of men, money, weapons, ammunition, food, clothing, and almost everything else an army needs to function. What the Americans had was Washington, an extraordinary collection of political and intellectual talent, the home field advantage, and most crucially, the willingness to keep fighting long enough for Britain to decide the war was not worth the cost. The early months of the war were discouraging. The British seized New York City in the summer of 1776 and nearly trapped Washington's entire army. Washington retreated across New Jersey with the British in pursuit, his army dwindling from disease, desertion, and the simple fact that many enlistments were expiring and men were going home. By December 1776, the cause looked nearly lost. Thomas Paine wrote again, this time a pamphlet called The Crisis, which Washington had read aloud to his troops. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. And then on the night of December 25th, Washington did something nobody expected. He loaded his freezing, desperate army into boats and crossed the ice-choked Delaware River in a howling storm, and in the early hours of December 26th, he attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. It was a complete surprise. The Hessians, German mercenaries in British employ, were overwhelmed. About 1,000 were captured. American casualties were minimal. Within days, Washington had followed up with another victory at Princeton. The victories were small in military terms, but their psychological impact was enormous. The revolution was not dead. The fight was still on. The war went back and forth for the next several years. The British strategy was essentially to strangle the rebellion, seize the major cities, control the coast, divide the colonies, and wait for the revolutionary spirit to exhaust itself. The American strategy was essentially to survive, avoid decisive defeat, keep the army in the field, make the war as expensive and painful as possible for Britain. The turning point came in the fall of 1777, at Saratoga, New York. A British force under General John Bergen, attempting to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies by driving south from Canada along the Hudson River, was cut off, outmaneuvered, and surrounded by a Continental Army under Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. On October 17, 1777, Bergen surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men. It was the most significant American military victory of the war, and it had an immediate, decisive diplomatic consequence. France entered the war on the American side. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of our journey through the fascinating history of America. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson and uncovered a few mysteries along the way. From humble beginnings to pivotal moments that shaped a nation, we've only scratched the surface of America's incredible story. If you'd like to continue this journey with us, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to History and Mystery. Your support helps us bring more captivating stories from the past to life. Join us in Part 2, where we'll explore even more of the people, events, triumphs, and turning points that helped shape the United States into the nation it is today. We will be covering parts like Building a Nation, 1783 to 1800, Expansion and Conflict, 1800 to 1848, The Road to War, 1848 to 1861, and so on. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, history is full of mysteries waiting to be uncovered.